Yes, this is the new logo.
You want to sit there? Sit there. Well, the time has arrived, so I think we shall begin.
Excuse me, my husband's still at the talk, isn't he?
Okay.
And mine.
Good evening to you. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Lord, we are grateful this evening for your presence with us. And we ask that you would open our minds and our hearts to better understand and appreciate all the benefits that are ours because you are with us. And we thank you that you have spoken through your servant C.S. Lewis, and that he so faithfully shared his thoughts with us. So help us to once again benefit from what we hear today and to follow you with joy and faithfulness. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So the life of C.S. Lewis is our subject for today. And as usual, please go ahead and ask your questions at any point. Please don't feel like you can't interrupt me as we go through with this. Folks who knew Lewis well said this was probably the best, most natural picture of him. There are many photos of Lewis, but they said this caught something about him about as well as anyone. You see the years here, 1898 he was born. He was born just outside Belfast, Ireland. And he died November 22nd, 1963. Now that date should ring a bell with you. Who else died November 22nd, 1963? Kennedy, yes, John Fitzgerald Kennedy had his assassination on that day. So. Here's a picture of Lewis, well actually Warren, Lewis's brother, who is a little older than he, and then their father, Albert, and Clive, that's what the C stands for, Clive Staples Lewis. Now, when Lewis was even younger than you see him on this picture, here he's about 10 years old because he was born in 98. When he was about 5 years old, he informed everybody that he, from now on, would only answer to the name Jaxie. And he stuck with that his whole life. His friends called him Jack. They dropped the Jaxie business as he got older, but he remained Jack throughout the rest of his life. His mother, right about this age, and apparently from this picture, this was taken after the death of his mother from cancer, and it was an early and extremely traumatic, as you can imagine, experience that shaped Lewis. He had extremely high regard for his mother, and less so with his father. That was always a strained relationship. So the loss of that female figure from Lewis colors his whole life. This is the house where he lived in as a child. If you read his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he describes what life was like as a youngster for him here. As you see, it's a sizable home, especially by English standards. His father was a solicitor, so he was involved with the law and making a good salary. The house had many, many hallways and small rooms on the various floors, and the two boys had pretty much the run of it. And Lewis says that wherever you look, there were stacks of books, books everywhere, and he was free to read any of those. He was encouraged to read any of them, and he wanted to. And he said many of them were perfectly well designed for children, and some explicitly not designed for children, but he had access to them all, and from his youngest years, just read voraciously. He said at one point in his life, "I can never have a cup of tea or a book that is too large for me." One of the things that he and his brother did in this very large house was a lively play with the imagination. They invented a land called boxing. And as you see from those watercolors at the bottom that Lewis painted, that Lewis had quite a few skills besides just plain writing well. And boxing was an animal land. What does that sound like? Narnia, that's right. So there's the beginnings of Narnia going on when Lewis was barely a teenager already. A whole community of animals and a lengthy dialogue that goes on for some time. So this is a book about his childhood chronicles. Notice it's introduced by Douglas Gresham. Douglas Gresham is his son-in-law, and we'll hear a lot more about that. In Lewis's, both Warren, his older brother, and Jack, might as well just call him Jack because that's what he wanted. His father, who, for all sorts of reasons, well, one, that it was not unusual to send your children off to school somewhere, a boarding school. And Lewis's father did the same with his two sons. Now this was after the death of the mother. So you see, here's these two boys shipped off to England from Ireland, still mourning the death of their mother, and being sent to these horrible schools. This one was one of a number that they were both sent to, Wynyard School. You see, he was there from the ages of 10 to 12, along with his older brother Warren. The experience there was horrendous. And for Lewis in particular, the master of the school, as you often read about in those old English novels, the master was incredibly strict and cruel. And so much so that shortly after this time, he was found to be insane, and the whole school was closed down. But this was one of the schools where Lewis had his hard knocks. Part of the problem with Lewis is that he was physically uncoordinated. He had an oddity with the way his thumb was in his hands that made it difficult for him to catch and throw balls and things like that. So for him, the English propensity at these schools for soccer and all those athletic games was for him sheer misery. He was sort of a loner, and of course was much more happy in the library being able to read than he was out on the playing fields. Well, the boys complained a lot, so they did get to go to a number of these schools. Some were a little better than others. But finally, his father sent him to William T. Kirkpatrick, who was called the Great Knock by his students. And he took in students, probably just one. I don't recall that there was anybody with Lewis in William Kirkpatrick's home. And there, this was, for Lewis, he says, as strict as this teacher was, he says for him, it was strong beef and good ale to him to be there studying in this capacity. The Knock was the sort of person who, whatever you said, he'd say, "Stop! What do you mean by this? Explain yourself. In what sense was this the case?" And Lewis couldn't say anything without being confronted and forced to think through Lewis writes, again in Surprised by, all this is in Surprised by Joy. He says, finally, after being reduced almost to tears, Kirkpatrick would say, "Well, don't you see then that you had no business saying anything at all on the subject?" Well, this is what Lewis referred to as strong ale and good beef. He really liked being challenged. He liked the exercises of the mind. And we see in this how God is preparing him for the gifts that we get in such books as The Great Divorce that we just read. Well, he never went to schools as we would know them, in terms of public school before college. He had these tutors and these private schools. But when it came time for college, he managed to get into Oxford. And so in 1917, at the age of 19, he enrolls in Oxford University. And he's only there a few months because you know as well as I what's going on in England in 1917. World War I is already raging at this point. And Lewis felt it was his duty to serve. So he was only there, as I say, just a few months, and he enlisted, went through some very brief cursory training, and was sent off to the trenches in the Somme. And there he stayed in the trenches for 5 months, at which time he was wounded. A shell fragment, actually it was friendly fire. Shell fragments caused 3 wounds for Lewis. To the left chest, broke a rib, a superficial wound to the left wrist, and to the left leg. Well, it was bad enough for him to be sent to the hospital, and then another hospital, and finally sent home. These were debilitating enough wounds that he was no longer of use to the army. So he was sent home at that point. But it was enough time in those trenches for him to learn what men learned being involved in World War I. As he was preparing to go to those trenches, Lewis met a young man who was training with him, whose name was Paddy, P-A-D-D-Y, Paddy Moore. And they became buddies. So Lewis is the one smoking the pipe on the left, and Paddy is on the right. And they made a pact with each other that if either of them were killed in action, the other would take care of the deceased one's parents. I think in both cases, well, it would have been a father for Lewis and a mother for Paddy. Well, sure enough, Paddy was killed in the war. And when Lewis came back, true to his word, atheist though he was, he still had his honor and his integrity. And for the next great number of years, he took care of Mrs. Moore. Her nickname was Minty Moore. And as they got established in Oxford, she lived with him in his house, and he took care of her right up to the time of her death. There are a lot of stories about that aspect of Lewis's life when you study just how close did this relationship actually get. And Lewis scholars just argue with each other about just those sorts of things. And as she got older, she got right demanding at times, and he would be working in his office, and she would kind of insist that he come home and bring her a quart of milk or something like that. And it's interesting about Lewis that he was a true servant to her, and whatever she asked for, if he could do it, he did it. It was a remarkable relationship. Well, here's some pictures of Lewis in his youth and early adulthood. Good-looking sort of man. So after his own training is finished, he applies for and is hired at Magdalen College. I don't know if you know, but Magdalene, you know, Mary Magdalene, in England, they call that Magdalen. And so in England, you don't talk about Magdalen College, you talk about Magdalen College. And there happens to be a Magdalen College at Oxford, and there's a Magdalen College at Cambridge, both schools. So here's a picture on the main street running through Oxford University. It's called High Street. I ate a meal in a restaurant there one time. I don't remember the meal, but it's when I discovered English cream that they pour, you know, the custard kind of loose cream. And I had a piece of apple pie for dessert, and they came out and it was just loaded, just poured into this puddle of English cream. And I thought I just would die right there on the spot. So I'm still trying to figure out how to make that stuff because it's remarkable. Well, I digress. What you see here is Magdalen College, where he was hired to teach. His subject and specialty was Renaissance and medieval English literature. He was expert in other things and taught some other things, but that was mainly what he taught. Now, if you know the English college and university system, there are not daily classes. You are given an assignment, you are assigned a tutor, and you're given an assignment of readings. And then you write a paper based on the readings and with whatever your tutor has told you to do. And you have most of the week to do that. You might meet with the tutor once, no more than twice a week. And then you would go into the tutor's rooms. And in England, these tutors had not just an office, but a whole apartment where they lived. And so they would invite the students into their living rooms, and they'd sit in easy chairs and smoke and drink their tea, and they would be grilled by the tutor on whatever they'd read that week. Then there were lectures that took place that were related to these classes, but there was absolutely no expectation that you had to go to these lectures, you know, as long as you knew your stuff. So it's kind of a backward system from the way we do school here in America. Have any of you been to Oxford? Okay. Well, you see High Street there. So we're walking toward the steeple. The steeple is where you enter. And there you see the steeple, and there's the main entrance. And you walk in on High Street, and there are these old buildings that form a square. And then there is the new building, new as in 1735.
When was Oxford built?
I'm sorry?
The old building, when was that built?
Anybody know? Very old, going back to medieval times. I would say the 1400s, 1500s, something like that. Maybe earlier. I could go back to the 1200s because Oxford and Cambridge are both really, really old institutions. All right, here's the chapel that the arrow is pointing to, right where the steeple is. When Lewis was converted to Christianity at the age of 31, he took his faith seriously, and he started to attend chapels every day at whatever, in this case, Magdalen College. And every college in England, the university is composed of many different colleges, and every college has its own chapel. And Lewis was there every day. He sat right there. As his books became more popular and as his respect grew at Oxford, he was asked to preach, even though he was not ordained. He often preached for some of these various colleges. More on that in a bit. So these cloisters, as you see, going all the way around, forming the square. There you see what a cloister would look like on the inside. And you can see the green that's in the middle of that. We would call them quads in a lot of American colleges. And then if you stand right there and you look down, you see the new building. And that's what you see in this picture here. I'm standing right there and I'm taking a picture of the new buildings. C.S. Lewis's rooms were right there. Remember, it's not an office. He has a suite of rooms where he teaches there, as did all the tutors and professors. Now, there's a very famous place here, and that is Addison's Walk. Addison, the English poet and scholar, for some reason has a significant walkway named for him. And once again, you see Lewis's new building there, and here's the gate that leads into Addison's Walk. And this is what it looks like walking around Addison's Walk in Magdalen College. You walk around the whole square, all the way around it on a beautiful path, tree covered like this. I've had the privilege of doing that twice. And this is, again, the green space. Often there's cattle in there. All right. Now, Lewis has gotten to be good friends with a number of people, many of whom they were new names for me when I started studying this. But one of them was his brother, Warren, and one was J.R.R. Tolkien, who most all of us know because of all the Hobbit books. Lewis complains because he's finding all the people he finds most attractive to be with are Christians. And he's an atheist, and he finds this perplexing and puzzling at the same time. He loves to go on walks. He would walk in the Cotswold Hills. He would walk wherever he could get a chance. It was one of his favorite things to do, to spend a whole weekend just walking around in the hills and eating in the pubs along the way. A group of these friends got together and met, more about this in a minute, and formed a group called the Inklings. I-N-K-L-I-N-G-S, the Inklings. They were all scholars, they were all writers, and they loved being together. And I think virtually all of them were Christians. And so Lewis is having all these conversations as these groups get together at their favorite pub, and I'll show you more of that later too. And they are discussing all sorts of things. They're reading chapters in their book. Lewis is reading chapters from the Chronicles of Narnia that he just wrote. Tolkien is reading sections of the Hobbit books to the group and getting criticism from them all about this. So all this time, Lewis is thinking about God because it keeps coming up in all these conversations. And things slowly come to a head. And he writes toward the end of Surprised by Joy, again, his autobiography, he writes this as it relates to Addison's Walk and his time at Oxford College. You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him, capital H, whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come to me. In the Trinity term, that would have been May and June, of 1929, he's 30. 31 years old at this point. I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. I did not see then what is now the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility which will accept a convert even on such terms. The prodigal son at least walked home on his own feet. But who can duly adore that love which will open the high gates to a prodigal who is brought in kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance of escape? The words, that is Jesus' words, compel them to come in, have been so abused by wicked men that we shudder at them. But properly understood, they plumb the depth of the divine mercy. The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and his compulsion is our liberation. This is written in the chapter toward the end of his autobiography. The chapter is called Checkmate, because this is what happened. He no longer has any intellectual integrity that will allow him to deny God. He's been cornered theologically and through the use of reason by his friends and by God himself. Kind of like the hound of heaven, if you know that phrase, who's always nipping at the heels of somebody running away from God. He finally is caught. He's cornered, and he has no choice, even though he hates it, than to admit that God is God. And here are two of the people that were most powerful in this. Hugo Dyson, who is a professor of English literature at Merton College in Oxford, and of course, J.R.R. Tolkien, professor of Anglo-Saxon literature at Pembroke College in Oxford. Now that was 1929. 2 years later, he writes in his journal, that is, Lewis writes, he, Hugo Dyson, stayed the night with me in college. Remember, he has an apartment, so there's bedrooms and sofas and things like that to stay the night. Dyson stayed the night with me in college. Tolkien came too, and did not leave until 3 a.m. We began in Addison's Walk, just after dinner, discussing metaphor and myth, interrupted by a rush of wind which came so suddenly on this still, warm evening and sent so many leaves pattering down that we thought it was raining. We continued on Christianity. A good, long, satisfying talk in which I learned a lot. This is 2 years. He has admitted that there's a God, but he's not yet a Christian. He's simply a theist now instead of an atheist. September 1931. October, the next month. Now, what Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this. If I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. And again, this is the idea of a God sacrificing himself. And that if I met the idea of a God, that if I met the idea of God sacrificing himself to himself, I liked it very much, provided I met it anywhere except in the Gospels. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth. A myth working on us in the same way as all the others, but with the tremendous difference that it really happened. Does this amount to belief in Christianity? At any rate, I am now certain, A, that this Christian story is to be approached, in a sense, as I approach the other myths. B, that it is the most important and full of meaning. I'm also nearly sure that it really happened. So he's getting really close to accepting Christianity. Not quite there yet. It finally happens. He's with his brother Warren. They're in one of these motorcycles that has a little coach attached to the side, and they're going to the Whipsnade Zoo. And Lewis says, when I got into the cart, I did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. When I got to the zoo, I did. That's his conversion experience. Not everybody apparently has fireworks and tears and everything. I think I'll skip that in the interest of time. You can see again the new building there. It is noted for the deer park that's aside of it. There's a special kind of English deer that they have kept there. And Lewis's rooms were so situated that he could look out one of his windows and see these deer. As Lewis's fame spread, he started writing books like the Screwtape Letters and others that became very popular, especially in America. He was always more popular in America than he was in England. He was asked by the BBC to do some talks on the radio about the Christian faith. And this is where his book, Mere Christianity, comes from. The various sections each week from those were broadcast, and those were combined into the book, Mere Christianity, in 1952. A lot of these war years, a lot of these talks were in the war years, so Lewis is trying to help the morale in England. I'd say one of Lewis's most famous and potent conversations, he's aware that England is largely non-Christian, that people have lost faith, that most people didn't go to church, didn't believe in God. And so he's trying in his own way, and that's what Mere Christianity does, is tries to convince you of the rationality of the Christian faith. One of his most famous quotes is right here. I am trying here, again, this is right out of Mere Christianity. I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Lewis loves to do this. Get you into a corner, like God cornered him, checkmated him. You got to choose. It's either this or it's that. Lewis says those sorts of things over and over again. You must make your choice. Either this man, Jesus, was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon. Or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let's not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. I don't know that it gets much more powerful than that. This is the lecture hall in Oxford where he delivered those lectures. And when C.S. Lewis delivered a lecture, the lecture hall was full, standing room only. And this area where we're looking here just filled with bicycles of all the students that would come there. That was not typical of lectures by Oxford professors. And this is the very room where he gave those lectures. Now, down High Street a little bit, we run into the university church. In these major English universities, every college has its own chapel, and then there's one big church, which is the main church for the whole community. So this is the University Church of St. Mary, Oxford University. And that is the pulpit inside where Lewis preached his most famous sermon, The Weight of glory. It's also the place where the trial of Archbishop Cranmer, who wrote the foundation of our prayer book, where he had his trial. You recall there was Henry VIII, who turned England away from the Catholic Church. His son, Edward, was very Protestant. He dies early. Then comes Mary, Bloody Mary, who tries to turn England back to Catholics again. And it's during this period of time when Archbishop Cranmer is put on trial by Queen Mary. Now you see here a picture of him during the trial and how he's up higher. And here, if you go there today, I put my finger right there, is a pillar right across from where the pulpit is. You see where the pulpit is, where they built a platform so that Cranmer could be raised up a little bit higher. He was found guilty of heresy and burned at the stake right outside this building. And it was a nasty, nasty affair, as it turned out. He did not burn as easily as some people did who were burned. So here's some pictures of Lewis. You can see his good nature. People, again, who knew Lewis well, said that he really looked like nothing more than a happy gentleman farmer. They said he could wear out a brand new tweed jacket in 2 weeks. And there you see kind of a frumpy tweed jacket that he's wearing right there in that picture. And he loved his pipe. He and his brother Warren bought a house outside of Oxford called the Kilns, because there used to be some ovens there for making bricks. And that was the home where he lived pretty much till his death. Now, I'd mentioned the Inklings before. They are very key to understanding this whole group of folks that was Lewis's main social outlet. C.S. Lewis, his brother Warren, J.R.R. Tolkien, a gentleman named Charles Williams, Hugo Dyson, that we already heard about, who was so central in the conversion of Lewis, another man named Owen Barfield, who was a lifelong friend of Lewis's, and others as well. They would meet, well, I'll get to that in a minute. There's Tolkien, if you ever saw a picture of the writer of the Hobbits. There's two good pictures of him. Tolkien is Roman Catholic. They would gather once a week in Lewis's rooms, or some other professor's rooms, and the other time they would meet at this pub called the Eagle and Child. The Inklings call it the Bird and the Baby. And as you walk in the door, the picture at the top is about what you see. There's kind of a long hallway with rooms to either side. And about 2/3 of the way down the hallway, you see this room that you see at the bottom of the picture. And that is where the Inklings met every week for years and years and years. I just had to have my pint of bitters right in that room. It had to be. Had to be. You see the arrow pointing to the picture, or the little plaque, and here's what it says. His brother W.H. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and other friends met every Tuesday morning between the years 39 and 62. That's how long this went on. In the back room of this, their favorite pub. These men, popularly known as the Inklings, met here to drink beer and to discuss, among other things, the books they were writing. I do want to join that club. A little late now. Lewis gets so popular in America, especially with his book, Screwtape Letters, that he ends up in a cover of Time magazine in 1947. And in little letters there, the subtitle says, C.S. Lewis, His Heresy, Christianity. Again, you can see we're really entering into the modern skeptical age where traditional Christianity is seen by many as the heresy. He taught there at Oxford many years. His British professor colleagues had a lot of jealousy about Lewis and anger at Lewis for two reasons. One, he was writing books in theology and he had no theological degrees, so he was writing books out of his own area of expertise, and that drove these professors angry, drove them mad. Second is, he was so incredibly popular, and everything that he wrote was selling by the millions, so there was a lot of jealousy involved there. There's two levels to being a professor in England. One is to be a tutor. I already described the tutor. The higher one, you can get promoted to be a full professor. And when you're a full professor, you don't have to mess with the tutors anymore. You can you're free to do your research, you're free to write books, you're free to give the lectures, but all the messy business of working one-on-one with students is relieved from you. Oxford University just would not give Lewis that higher level. He remained a tutor there. Well, finally, later in his life, he's invited to teach basically the same thing at the Magdalen College, no connection, in Cambridge. So he moves shop from Oxford over to Cambridge. And here's a picture of that Magdalen College. And again, you see its arrangement, as is so often the case, the square, which is the main portion of the college, and then off to the side, some other buildings. And then there is the newer building, kind of like the other Cambridge. And behind there, too, was a garden area. Not as extensive as Addison's Walk, but a place back there where you can walk as well. So he went on and continued his teaching at Cambridge College until the end of his life. Here's what it looks like inside that green. Lewis's rooms, right here. Chapel here, and in there is the commons where they eat. That's again the new building, not so new anymore. And the commons area. The professors, of course, all sit in the very back of that room on the raised dais, and the students sit in the long rows. In America, there is a woman, one of thousands, who are reading C.S. Lewis's work. And she is starting to write letters to Lewis because she's very impressed with these works. Her name is Joy David Min Gresham, and giving it away, Lewis. He's going to end up marrying her. He was married just from 57 to 1960, just a few years. She is a divorced Jewish American communist. Ex-communist, I should say. Newly converted to Christianity, largely through the efforts of Lewis. They start writing. She and her two sons, after the divorce, move over and stay in England for a little while. Talks with Lewis, fascinating story. And they get to know each other, and then she goes back to America again. And then finally, once the divorce there is completed, she moves back to England and stays there. She and Lewis become very, very close friends. She eventually develops cancer, bone cancer. And of course is taken to the hospital, and you can imagine in the mid-50s what a diagnosis of bone cancer means for a person. So, meanwhile, her visa has run out, and England is threatening to send her back to America again. Well, Lewis cannot imagine having her carted back to England with only a few years left to live, a few months left to live. So he suggests to her that they have a marriage of convenience. They'll continue living separately, but if they are married, she will be able to stay in England for the remaining time. Well, as time goes on, Lewis becomes, well, he falls in love with her, let's just say it plain. She much earlier than he did, but he finally does. And this civil marriage, while she's in the hospital, he invites a priest to come in, and they are united in marriage before God while she is deathly ill, thinking, again, it's just going to be a few weeks. Well, don't you know she goes into remission, and a rather full, complete remission, and they are granted 3 years of marriage together. They even take a trip to France, or to Greece and back again. And Lewis has, in his 60s, the joys of marriage that most people have in their 20s and 30s, he says. He writes at one point, in medical language, I had osteoporosis, speaking of himself. Fair screaming and hollerin' I was, and no sleep without dope. It all gives me the feeling I haven't got the face to ask God for any more miracles. I shall, though. He likes us to stand up to him, like Abraham over the destruction of Sodom, or like the importunate widow with the unjust judge. By the same token, Joy is a converted Jewess, and she says we Gentiles read the Old Testament and even some of Jesus' utterances all wrong because we start with the assumption that there's no humor in them. Apparently, to anyone who understands Jewish wit from within, it is obvious that the stories I have mentioned, and also nearly the whole of Jonah and the unjust steward, are funny stories. Think this over. I didn't say come and call on me, drat you. I said come and dine and talk late into the night and sleep here and go away breakfasted. I shall be content with nothing less. Thus he writes to Reverend Canon Harold Blair in 1959 during the period of Joy's remission. Here's Lewis in his older years wearing another frumpy tweed jacket. Well, as we would expect, the remission did not last more than 3 years, and Joy goes into a tailspin and dies a very quick and nasty death. She is buried, and this is what Lewis writes on her grave. Here the whole world, stars, water, air, and field and forest, as they were reflected in a single mind, like cast-off clothes were left behind in ashes, yet with hope that she, reborn from holy poverty in Lenten lands, hereafter may resume them on her Easter day. Now, I included this because of the term Lenten lands. You recall we talked about shadow lands and how Lewis refers to the whole human experience on earth as shadow lands. The realities are up in heaven, and what we have down here are things that remind us of God's plans for us in the future, but not in their fullness. So it's shadowy here. It's the Lenten lands, whereas Easter Day, of course, will be our resurrection. It is not hard for you to get the DVD or whatever you will of the movie Shadowlands. And it's the story that I have just told you in more detail of Lewis and Joy getting together and their 3 years together, and Lewis's deep depression at her death. Lewis writes, a grief observed which I think is one of the best things to be read by anybody in preparation for grief experiences. He writes a grief observed as he charts in journal format his own personal reaction to the death of his wife. I cannot recommend it too highly. Lewis attended church at Holy Trinity Anglican Church in Headington in Oxford. He would come home on weekends, even when he taught in Cambridge, and stay in the kilns and go to church here. There is his grave, the flat stone. And here is the stone that Warren built for C.S. Lewis and himself. This is the interior of the church, and on the side there's a window that has been etched in glass to commemorate Lewis's connection with this church. It's mostly about stories from the Book of Narnia. Joy had two sons that came to live with them, so it would have been Warren and C.S. Lewis and Joy and the two boys. Douglas Gresham, you see David there and Douglas. A bit about David in a minute. Douglas Gresham is the younger son of Joy David Gresham Lewis. And here's a little bit about his interesting life. Douglas Gresham and his wife Marie lived in Rathvinden House in Leylandbridge, County Carlow, Ireland, before moving to their house in Malta in 2008. They had 5 children, 3 sons, James, Timothy, and Dominic, and 2 daughters, Lucinda and Melody. Prior to this, he owned 4 farms in Tasmania, Australia, with his wife Marie and their 4 children. Gresham has written an autobiography entitled Lenten Lands. There it is again, Lenten Lands, to use Lewis's term, in which you get from somebody who was there and grew up there the story of life with Joy and Clive Staples Lewis together, which chronicles his life from birth to the age of 28 in 1973. A fictionalized young Douglas Gresham is a character in the 1993 film Shadowlands that I just told you about, in part derived from Lenten Lands. In the film, Gresham is played by the American actor Joseph Mazzello. There is no character derived from Douglas's brother David in the film, or in the stage play in which the film was portrayed, was based, although both Douglas and David were portrayed as characters in the original teleplay on which the stage play was based. Douglas grows up in the Christian faith. David rejects it. David was there was something wrong with David. He was very difficult to live with. He may have been manic depressive. He eventually re-embraced his Judaism. Remember, his mother was a converted Jew. And you just don't read much about him at all because they didn't communicate with each other. I've included, let me just say to end the whole story, Lewis dies a few years after Joy dies. He was not feeling well, as you saw about his osteoporosis and things. He was gradually declining and just died one night in bed. His brother Warren, who always struggled with alcohol, descended very sadly after that too, and he lived quite a while after Jack died, but was in bad shape. I've included a few quotes that I think are some of Lewis's best, and we'll close with them. I didn't go to religion to make me happy. I always knew a bottle of port could do that. If you want a religion to make you feel really comfortable, I certainly don't recommend Christianity. All of these are worthy of some thought, but I'll just go through them quickly. You can get them on the site afterwards and look at them in more detail. From his book, The Problem of Pain, he writes, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So as we think about the nature of pain, one of Lewis's insights about why there is pain is that it's God's megaphone trying to get our attention because he can't get it any other way. The great thing, if one can, is to stop regarding all the unpleasant things as interruptions of one's own or real life. The truth is, of course, that what one calls the interruptions are precisely one's real life, the life God is sending you one day by day. Here's from the ending of the last book of the Chronicles of Narnia. The children are in what appears to be Narnia to them, but it's changing very quickly. And as it turns out, their earthly life is over in a train accident, and they're there in Narnia. And they're moving on now into heaven. All their life in this world and all their adventures had only been the cover and the title page. Let me read that again. All their life in this world and all their adventures had only been the cover and the title page. Now, at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. What an incredible way to talk about what awaits us. Lewis on love. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe. Lock it, that is your heart. Lock your heart up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not become broken. Your heart will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. The only place outside heaven you can be perfectly free from the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest, most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities that we should conduct all our dealings with one another. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. It is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. Let me read that again. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. If he is your Christian neighbor, he is holy in almost the same way, for in him also Christ is truly hidden. And then finally, there is someone that I love even though I don't approve of what he does. There is someone I accept though some of his thoughts and actions revolt me. There's someone I forgive though he hurts the people I love the most. That person is me. And that's the end of it. We're out of time, and I'm out of slides. So there it is.